Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to paint this grotto scenery. I've been seeing a lot of pictures on Pinterest and I decided to make my own version. This is just out of my imagination though, using a combination of elements which I might have been inspired by when I was looking through some pictures. You can mask off the sides, but I'm going to just leave a bit of space around the edges, and I just did a rough outline so I remember to not paint over it. And I'm going to roughly divide up the space that I have with the elements that I want to include in my composition. I want to be looking out from the cave or the grotto, and I'm going to add a small beach with some cliffs and greeneries on either side. To add depth, I'm going to show layers of the cliff sides, and this way it'll be easier to divide up the sections as I paint later on. And just a friendly reminder, if you're drawing for a watercolor painting, try to not press the pencil with too much force so the tip of the pencil doesn't damage the paper. It's also light enough to be painted over and easily erased when you need to make some changes. And for those of you who doesn't like to draw, I'll have the outline in my coffee shop. Okay, I'm quite happy with the sketch, so next I'll go over the colors. This is Sepia by Holbein, Sap Green by Holbein, Indigo by Schmincke, Cerrulean Blue by Holbein, Yellow Ochre by Holbein, Permanent Yellow Deep by Holbein, Vermilion by Holbein, Crimson Lake by Holbein, and Bleedproof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. Okay, I'm going to start to paint. I'm going to paint the greeneries first, and I'm just going to activate and put some paint on my palette. I have the Permanent Yellow Deep, Vermilion, and Sap Green. And I'm going to add some Sap Green into the Permanent Yellow Deep as well. I'm going to start painting the edge of the shrub using the light yellow-green mixture. Then for the bottom, I use a mix of sap green and indigo. While the surface is still damp, sometimes I like to also dot in a bit of vermilion and I just let the paint somewhat mingle with each other. I will treat this as one layer of shrubs. Then at the back, if I want to add another shrub, I want to make sure that the light green is adjacent to a darker value. This way, those two shrubs or those two layers will look like they're separate from each other. So that's basically the technique that I'm going to keep repeating as I paint the greeneries on this painting. This also goes for the greeneries on top of the cliffside, but because this is further in the composition, I want to use a lighter consistency. So as the paint dries, it'll be a little bit more faded compared to whatever is in the foreground. For extra variations for the tone of green, sometimes I like to add more indigo in the mixture, so this will create more of a darker, deeper green, and if I want to mute the color, I will add more vermilion into the green mix. I feel like all the colors are fairly similar to each other, so for this one, I'm not really going to add the dots of vermilion. Instead, I'm going to use it in the mixture. This includes the darker value with extra indigo as well, so the overall green tone just looks more muted. Next, I'm going to paint the cliffs, and the first mixture I use is yellow ochre and vermilion, and at the bottom here I use a mix of sepia and indigo, which will create a gray. I mix this gray mixture into the brown mixture, and I'm going to use a light consistency to paint the base of the cliffs. Then while the surface is still damp, I just use more of the gray mixture for the darker values. Then, just like the greeneries, I'm going to paint the rocky cliffs section by section. For a bit of color variation, you can always play with the ratio or even add some greens into the brown, as long as the vermilion and the yellow ochre mixture stays as the main color. Since I'm going to make the light come from the left side, which means the greeneries and the cliffs on the left will be facing away from the light, I made the values darker and more muted, whereas on the right I'm going to use brighter colors which are less muted. So this is pure from yellow ochre and vermilion without the gray mixed into it. As I'm painting this, I've left out a bit of space in between each section so the paint doesn't just completely run into each other and create a giant silhouette. This way I feel like the paint will also dry a little bit faster. Then for the darker values, I'm going to use the same mixture with added vermilion in the ratio and also a little bit of indigo. I'm going to paint the darker values carefully because the surface is still a little bit damp. I'm not going to spread it over too quickly because the paint will just run and cover the whole damp surface if you put too much all at once. This is what happened to me here, and if that's the case, while the surface is still damp, you can take off the excess paint with tissue. Sometimes I actually like to intentionally do this because once you take off the paint with tissue, sometimes you're left with this interesting texture, in which case I'm going to enhance some of the shapes so now the structure look a bit more interesting. With a darker value here, I just added more indigo in the mixture, and I'm being even more careful with the color because it's quite muted, so I don't want to accidentally cover the brighter areas. Since I want these cliffs to look further away, I am painting it at a smaller scale, and I use the darkest value to somewhat outline some of the extra details, like some giant stones near the water. I feel like I didn't have enough control with this size brush because this is painted at such a small scale, so I'm going to switch to my dagger brush and use the point to add those details and separate the sections of the cliffs. For the brighter shadows, I like to use the same mixture but with more vermilion in the ratio, whereas for the darker spots, then I would increase the indigo. For the left side, I'm using a mix of indigo and crimson lake, and as you can see, I can put a little bit more pressure and use thicker brush strokes to paint the textures because the scale is much larger since the cliff on the left side is closer to us. To increase the value of this, I would just add more indigo in the ratio. For the rock on the bottom right hand side, I'm going to first use the yellow ochre and vermilion mixture for the top parts. Then as I get towards the bottom of the page, since this area will be covered by the cave or the grotto, I'm going to use the more muted tones with added indigo. I'm going to do something similar to the left hand side, but because this is facing away from the light, I feel like it's going to be darker. And I feel like just using indigo by itself will make the color look a bit too cold. So I use a mixture of indigo and crimson lake to make it look like more of a purple tone instead. I'm also going to layer the same purple mixture over some of the shrubberies as well. Once I've painted everything in the foreground, I'm going to wait for them to dry and move back to the cliff on the left side, just adding more indigo to the darkest parts to build on the contrast. Next, I'm going to move on to paint the grotto itself, and for this I'm going to use the purple mixture from indigo and crimson lake, but on the left I'm going to use more indigo in the mix so it looks darker. To create a darker value, you can also add sepia to the indigo. This will create basically a black. And on the right, I'm going to still include some brighter parts, and this is from a mix of yellow ochre and vermilion. Going back to the bottom corners now, I'm going to layer on darker values. I've also switched to my dagger brush to get some sharp but varied line weights, which I find helps to create those nice jagged edges. While I'm painting the darker values, I'm also going to use the tip of my brush to paint some really thin branches. The bottom right corner here, I felt like the shape of the rocks were a bit weird, so I turned it into a shrub instead. Next, let's paint the sky. I started out by lightly dampening the surface, avoiding the areas of the greeneries. Then I'm going to use some cerulean blue, starting from the top, and I'm also going to leave some white negative spaces by wiggling my brush around randomly to leave out some space for the clouds. I will naturally run out of pigment from my brush as I get towards the bottom, but that's fine because I want the bottom to be lighter. In fact, I'm going to increase the contrast at the top by adding a bit of indigo into the cerulean blue. While the surface is still damp, I like to increase the saturation by just adding more cerulean blue. And once I'm happy with it, I'm going to dry it off with a hairdryer. Next, let's paint the water. Just like the sky, I'm going to start by dampening the surface. I'm going to start from the top, and for this I'm using a mix of indigo with a little bit of cerulean blue. Dominant color here is indigo though. I'm painting horizontally, so even when I've left out some white space, it'll still follow the direction of the water surface. As I get closer to the shoreline, I want to change up the color. I start introducing a greener tone by using a mix of cerulean blue and sap green. Even closer to the shoreline, I'm going to use the same green mixture but in a very light consistency, and right at the edge of the shore I'm going to use yellow ochre. For the base, I've mostly used a light to medium consistency. But while the surface is still a little bit damp, I'm going to build on the saturation as well as the values. So I'm using the same color mixture, following the direction of the water, and also using a thicker consistency. So the paint is thicker and therefore won't move as fast as a lighter consistency. I'm also going to add the shadows, especially next to the left cliff side. Everything is fairly damp, so I'm going to leave them to dry. Meanwhile, I'm going to paint the sand. For this, I'm using yellow ochre as the main color. This has a little bit of vermilion though, and a touch of indigo to make the color a bit less vibrant. And I also like to add little taps of vermilion in a very light consistency for some variation. Then I'm going to dry everything off before painting the cast shadow from the top of the grotto. I'm using the purple mixture from Indigo and Crimson Lake in the light to medium consistency. And I'm going to make this slightly textured to suggest that there are maybe some trees at the top. I'm also going to use the purple to create shadows underneath the shoreline. This is the shadow underneath the foam, but I'm going to paint the foam later on with bleed-proof white. It's up to you how saturated you want the water to be. Personally, I don't want to overwork the painting because this is actually my second attempt. So I'm just being very careful as I add the texture on the water. I'm going to use a thick consistency of bleed-proof white to paint the foam at the edge of the shoreline. And I'm also going to add some highlights, especially near the cliffs. I'm imagining some waves crashing around the sides of the rocks. Since we've painted everything on the page so far, I'm going to add on the details like the branches on the trees. I'm using a medium to thick consistency of indigo and sepia. And I'm also using the tip of my dagger brush to create those really thin lines, but you can also use a liner brush or a size 0 brush for this. Now I'm going to look around and I feel like I need to increase the contrast, especially for the darker values to balance everything around the page and for the overall painting to not look too faded. I'm going to go back and forth in this though to make sure everything is balanced as a whole. I also realized I forgot to paint the hanging vines from the top of the grotto and the large tree on the left, something that I actually sketched out but I've painted over. I feel like this will make the composition look a little bit more dynamic, so I'm going to paint it over before adding the rest of the darker values. Okay, I think all the elements are painted now, so I'm going to readjust the saturation and value for the overall painting. The adjustment step will always differ for everyone. It just depends which part need to be refined. But that's basically it for this painting. It ended up being a bit more complex than I intended at the beginning because of the textures. But either way, I hope you still learned something new from this tutorial. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. Thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!